Hi, welcome to the CI Fellows webinar, and in this particular series is part of the Current Focus series. As you, those of you who've been with us regularly, you know that we've had some hot topics that we've been exploring over time, and so it's really become that. It's now something that we seem to be doing on a regular basis, as opposed to our regular programming that we've seen in the past, exploring various topics at a more leisurely pace. So I appreciate your joining us for CI and navigating social change. And so, as you've probably seen in the description, and as you've probably seen in headlines all over, how important all of this, all of these developments, have been to not just various societies around the globe, but also to companies. And so we're not going to delve into, obviously, the socio-political, theoretical aspects as well, philosophical ones, but we also, pardon me.
I think you're muted, Cynthia.
Cynthia, we can't hear you.
So sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So we're going
Okay.
to delve into. Sorry, I had a little issue with my throat. So we're going to be delving into how intelligence, we can use intelligence, to help our organizations, whatever form, commercial, nonprofit, and educational and so forth, negotiate these changes, because typically when we are conducting intelligence, we're working on a number of different key questions and so forth. But lately, we've been hit by a series of very rapidly developing events. And so that puts particular pressure on Intel practitioners. As such, we need to talk about how we conduct Intel so we can be more effective. At the same time, it also demands different tools, because when we're talking about things like social change or the pandemic, we're really talking about also enlisting tools, that exercise foresight, and to have it and to do it more rapidly than we have been in the past. And with these types of social changes that we've been seeing in the headlines as well, with Black Lives Matter and other issues that are being brought to bear. These also mean that we need to understand where they're going, but these are all rather new, right? These are uncharted waters. So what are companies thinking, and how are Intel practitioners supporting them, and also what are we not doing that we could be doing as well? So other things we could do with our toolkits. So this is why we're doing this, and now, I'm going to advance these slides, and just to introduce some of our fellows. But I won't talk about the council today and provide some background, because I think we've been well enough into the series. But just to know that what we're doing here today is really what we do. We're in service to the profession and the practice of Intel. And we have members all over the world joining us. On today's webinar, we have Dr. Brad Ashton, who will be joining us, Mark Chussell, Claudia Clayton. I'm Cynthia Chang Correa, the president of the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows, Parmalee Eastman as well, August Jackson, Derek Johnson, Clifford Kalb, and our secretary, Ellen Naylor. And so let's start with this question about how do we help our clients thrive. And these can be our internal clients. These can also be clients, external clients if you're consultants. But the idea here is that how do we help them thrive through this and not just survive through this? And we may feel that at this point, we're in survival mode. But it's really important that we have more presence and more control over this than we may actually feel. And so as we do this, I'm actually going to turn this over to Parmalee Eastman to start, because as we had been talking about preparing for this particular series, and she just has some really, I think, important thoughts. And so Parmalee, do you want to take this over, since this was your tagline, if you will?
Yes, I just wanted to bring up a couple of issues that are the changing demographics in the United States, and also some of the changes in the different generations, the values. These are both things that need to be taken and are being taken into account by organizations. the U.S. is really unique. It's going to be in a unique position. Well, it may not be that unique, but a lot of companies or countries have had to figure out how to accommodate the growth of different groups with different values from different ethnic and racial backgrounds. And we are certainly seeing some of the stress that comes from that. We will be minority majority by 2045, but just as there's never been one Caucasian group, there is no one minority group. So you have to it's a lot more complex, I think, for organizations to figure out who are our customers, how do we appeal to them, who are our employees, and how do we recruit in the future. And then we look at some of the cultural changes that are occurring that cross these groups. So we look at the different generational changes. Gen Z, and I'm actually kind of very familiar with Gen Z. I have two examples that I live with. But one of the things that they've been noted for as an example, is that they care much more than some of the generations before about the social values of the organizations with which they interact. They care that companies are socially responsible and environmentally friendly. And now, again, these are predominant values, but this is a change in this group. And there was a survey by the Retail Federation, 55% of them choose the brands that reflect their values. And so they have, direct responsibility for 44 billion of spending and an influence on much more spending in the United States. So how do you look at this generation and start to respond to them? You see two changes I'll just mention. One is socially responsible investing, where companies and the investment world has tried to include socially responsible or social impact and environmental impact into their thinking about investments, not just the financial return. And that is a change that is growing. And then the other one is the fact that they're going to be, this Gen Z is looking more at social responsibility in how they interact. So we see some short-term activities that looking at products, for example, and saying what do these names mean and how do we change it? So that's a short term. So I just wanted to throw these out as a way to start a conversation on both how can we help companies in the short term and our individual clients, and then the longer term, given these trends.
Yeah, and I think we can also, so you mentioned, you mentioned the idea of socially responsible investing, but companies are also beginning to move away from the idea of shareholder, of value, and more towards, social, the longer term investments, and also I think corporate values and principles. And so I think that that's also part of this wrapper, these broader trends that we're seeing. Whether or not our own organizations are there, this is what's out there. And,
Yes.
and so I think being aware of this is particularly important. And so I'd like to just open this up to see if other fellows have any thoughts about this particular question before we dive into more details about our practices, sources and methods, and so forth. And please note if you've muted yourselves.
Hey, Cynthia, this is August. How you doing today?
Great, thanks. How are you?
Doing all right. I'm actually in the middle of walking the dog. It's my one one source of sanity in the world right now, and I'm really excited to be able to join you all from the road. If I start to call you a good boy or I say sit, that's probably not directed at you. But one of the things I wanted to say. Related to the epistemology of thinking about generational change, I really appreciated the fact that Parmalee brought up a particular survey that reflected some of the some of the attitudes of Gen Z that she was bringing up as kind of factors in our current state of organizational change. The reason I appreciated that so much is because generational factors are some of those factors where it's really easy to get carried away with stereotypes or sometimes our own expectations of how another generation or people in another country or people of another ethnicity might think about a topic. And I facilitate a lot of steep and rapid scenario generation sessions, and I'm always challenging my stakeholders or participants when they start to go down that path. I always bring up the question, well, how do you know that? And so the fact that, Parmalee, you brought up the Retail Federation survey, I just wanted to chime in and say just how much I absolutely appreciated that sort of epistemological hygiene that you applied there to what could be, a very broad brush topic. So thank you very much.
Well, that's right. I think nuanced thinking, right, is particularly important in the intel work that we do. And I think oftentimes when we are when we're thinking more simplistically is when we might get blindsided because we're not looking for those signals and indicators that signal incremental changes. Now, something like this, however, there really wasn't much of a lead time. I think most people will agree. It's been a slow brew over decades, and some would argue even hundreds of years. But this is something that really did, I think, sneak up on most corporate decision makers, and even other organizational decision makers as well. And so now I think we're in this mode where we're having to develop situational awareness, and also helping to understand, well, what do we do next, right? What's next, and how do we respond to that? And I think for some organizations too, how do we lead, right? Because leadership now in this, is I think in some circles more important than ever before. Whereas before, it's okay to maybe not necessarily be the one to put the stake in the ground, but to follow somewhat. But I think there's some value for some organizations and some brands in doing so as well. So, any thoughts? Any other thoughts from our fellows here on the call? And August, thank you for multitasking so well.
Yeah, this Cliff. One of the thoughts I had was with regard to corporate behavior from a historical perspective versus corporate behavior from a COVID-19 perspective. There are some companies that in an industry I'm familiar with that has had a long history of being environmentally conscious, of being concerned about being fair in recruiting and in promoting and in recognizing the value of a broad variety of types of people, particularly in leadership positions. And those companies, which I would say fall into one bucket, don't really have a lot of change to do because it's always been their way. The ones that I think have a lot of change to do are the ones that are reacting for the first time to this particular event and wondering, how much do I have to change from my historical pattern? I might have been not conscious of these issues from a social perspective. I have always only focused on shareholder value as the ultimate purpose of being in business in the first place. And I think one of the things that happened is that, particularly regard to the younger people, and I'm not clear on the definitions of Z versus Y versus XYZ, but I know they're all younger than I am. What I think really matters is the way your company behaves as a result of COVID-19 as to whether or not the changes you make are seen as transient or permanent. And if you make them on a permanent basis and you move into the other crowd, which is always permanently interested in social values, environment, etc., I think of that may be what I might call a cultural source of competitive advantage, which may not have been something we thought about before as an element of competitive advantage.
Cliff, you make a really good point. I love that cultural source of competitive advantage because we're actually seeing that now. Even in in the movement, regarding racism and social justice, because what we're seeing is we're seeing some companies lead and basically they're not waiting for their competitors, right, to make the move. They're simply saying, okay, this is what feels right to us and certainly to our employees and so forth, and this is where we are, and they're getting kudos for it, right? And no, there's no doubt too that for some organizations there's a lot of research that goes into it, in terms of sentiment analysis and so forth, because a lot of this too is a Venn diagram where Intel overlaps with market research and market intelligence, and so I think we have to recognize that side of this as well. But I really do love I love that the way you express that. So. Anyone else have any thoughts about this before we get into some of the practice details? And then I'll also go to the chat as well, because I know we have some thoughts there too. No? Okay, so we've got here, let's see, Jim Miller, says to everyone, in case this is for those in the recording who don't have access to chat, and those, who may be dialing in, that Craig Fleischer has done a lot of work on non-market intelligence, and I think this is going to be more important as issues management will be important to market participation, i.e. increased demand for CSR, increased demand for regulation and growth of boycotts. Yes. And Parmalee had posted a note about Gen Zs, born in the 1990s and early 2000s. As Jonathan Dunnett says, diversity of thought and diversity of experience can be a huge asset from a CI perspective. Our team is very diverse, especially from a where we were born perspective. And I think that's a great point. And thanks for really, I think, sharpening that point for us, Jonathan. I think that, in fact, I even see this in the fellows body as well, where one of the reasons why I love having discussions like this with my fellow fellows and also with the broader audience is that we do have, we are bringing in diversity of thoughts, perspectives, and experience. And we've already seen scads of research that basically show that organizations that have this, from the C-suite on down, or actually from the board on down, tend to be more successful, financially even. So I think that it goes beyond just intelligence here. So that's it for the chat for now, and so let's move on to some of the ways that we're tackling these questions and these problems. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave it to the group to tackle what you want to lead with. But some of the things that we can talk about, because this topic is so vast, are things like demographic and cultural changes as we've talked about, but also how do we understand what's ahead. I know, August, you are doing you are doing a rapid scenario workshop for Skip, and so we would love to hear more about that as well, because I think that's one of the ways in which we do it, and then tracking evolving issues. How are we doing that, especially when we have a tremendous amount of demand on us. I'm talking to some Intel practitioners, and the volume of work have increased between 50 to 150%. So that's what people are doing right now, right? So the bandwidth, brands and sentiment, is also something that for us to talk about, identifying and minimizing biases, advising and how are we advising our intelligence users, our clients. And challenges and barriers that we're running up against as well. So any thoughts? Anything that is sort of a hot topic, something you want to talk about and get off your chest. And I'll open this up to the fellows and those of you in the audience. Just post in the chat or in the Q&A, what you would like us to tackle.
I just have one observation that I know intelligence tends to be very, it's very detailed. So we want good sources, and we're not broad-based surveys, but I have a colleague that's doing a lot of broad-based surveys to really dig down on that brands and sentiment that is trying to understand what the values are of the customers and how to market the brand to those values. Because one of the changes, obviously, is that this Gen Z wants, you got to tell them that what your brand values. So how do you include that in marketing that is in a way that feels authentic? Because if it's not authentic, Gen Z, and I'm just using them, I think it's broader than that. I'm just saying it's very strong in that generation. How Gen Z is going to figure that out. If you're saying I'm all for sustainable, but you send out your products in, huge cardboard boxes, that the actions don't coincide. So that's more of a consumer products example, but that may or may not be something that we're getting into as we work with clients to work with that side of the business.
Yeah, so I have a question for the group, because we're talking about generations that are different from, I think, most of us here in attendance, right? They're generally younger than us, and I'm coming at this from a Gen X angle. So how do we better understand Gen Z? Right? And, obviously there are reports that are out there and so on and so forth, but as we're conducting intelligence, how are some of us trying to understand the mindset of Gen Z, where that's going, how that's shaping the future, so that we can better understand what that future state's going to look like and how we can prepare for that, or even participate in that change in some fashion. So any thoughts about how we're doing this besides just reading reports and so forth? Any of us delving into the mindsets of Gen Zs and also millennials, right? Because this is not just a unigenerational movement, right? I think the power of some of what we're seeing in the headlines today is that this is really cutting across generations. So how do we see this, and how do we see what's next, right? That next movement, that people are going to care about, for intelligence purposes.
May I?
Yes.
Okay, this is Suki. I think there's a lot of people seem to forget that when you're talking about Generation Z, that a lot of their parents are Gen Xers. And one of the aspects about any generation currently still living, I mean, that's the majority of the population. So boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, that even though we are the smallest of those current generations, that we intersect the analog and the digital world. So we have a different mindset. So a lot of the children that are born of Gen Xers have also grown up with parents that both have worked, whereas a lot of people that are Gen Xers, maybe one parent worked. Sometimes there are parents that were boomers that both of them worked, but the majority. And so it was sort of Gen Xers were latchkey kids, the first generation that were latchkey kids. And so you have now these Generation Z children that are more savvy when it comes to technology, usually a little bit more savvy when it comes to socio-economic factors, because they've also been somewhat latchkey kids because both parents are working. So they've had to amuse themselves socially outside of home after school or at home or with other children. But so they have a different outlook. Then they also may have parents, Gen Xers, that were tending to be more idealistic in their stance, even if it was conservative or liberal. They were either way. So they have a different sort of perspective on the world. So they've been able to form their opinions a lot more individually than people that are Gen Xers, or because they were pretty much following what their boomer parents were doing. So there's all these different aspects that are playing into that. There's a company called Yext, YEXT, and they do online surveying for brands. So basically any brand that has a survey or any search information that's on that company, they have these great white papers that they've put out, and they do a lot of marketing and branding around Gen X and more towards Gen Y and Gen Z, but they've covered all the generations. There's other stuff, but I don't want to take up all the time, so I will go ahead and weigh back in a little bit of time.
Thank you, Suki. Thanks for that. And and it gets me thinking how important it is for us, oftentimes when we're working in Intel, especially those of us, who might be in our own departments or in solos, to tap the capabilities, right, of other functions within the organization. So, partnering with or consulting with folks who are in marketing and market intelligence, to be able to then harness the tools that they're using to be able to supplement what we do here, because most of us aren't doing this type of social demographic research, sentiment, analysis every day. And so it may be that we're doing it in part, but these are the folks that are thinking about it all the time. So I ask the audience, how often do you reach out, to colleagues who are really thinking about this sort of thing and harness their understanding for your intelligence applications as well. So, any thoughts out there in terms of from the fellows? And I see that we have another chat. I'll read Claudia's, just to keep in mind that although Gen Z will grow to a larger percentage of the market spending, right now the numbers I pull, and Claudia is a crack researcher, say that they are 20% of spending. And while the current events are on top of mind today, we also don't know the reaction of those who represent the other 80%. So it depends on what you're trying to understand, how Gen Z will shape the future, and there will be a huge impact down the road, or where the majority of consumers will be once COVID and other changes fade back a little bit. So, so I think, pulling us back from Gen Z a little bit, to take a broader view. So I appreciate that. Emily Pilar in our audience says, as for sources, maybe this is a little bit elementary, but social platforms are very much where Gen Z voices can be heard, namely Twitter and Instagram. Then other platforms follow. And so absolutely, I think, it's the social, sentiment analysis, using, social media intelligence is very important. Unfortunately, I think some of the search tools that are out there are not as robust, as text-based search tools. So it tends still to be, I think, a bit clunkier unless you're able to lock in, to a fee-based service. But yes, absolutely. Any other thoughts from our fellows and folks in our audience about some of these issues? And I think in particular too, how do we want to advise our intelligence users in light of some of our findings? And some of these conversations may be difficult, with them, or some perhaps some folks who are in leadership positions aren't necessarily paying as much attention to this as they should, or perhaps again they're struggling with, like so many people, to try to understand where this is all going, and part of this requires a frank conversation that perhaps we're not used to having within organizations about matters of race and society and so forth. And so are people out there grappling with this? And I want to, I'll read what Mark Chessel has just posted too, which I think aligns nicely. It says, if we want to be authentic, do we want to sound like we are marketing, segmenting, targeting by demographics, age, race, gender, wealth, education? Does that come across as sincere or pandering? Demographics are a substitute for attitudes, and sometimes a poor substitute at that. And I think that's an excellent point, and I think it speaks to the point that was made earlier in this conversation about generalizing and and understanding the nuances as well. So anybody else have any thoughts about this within our panel and our audience?
If I may. Oh, go ahead, Derek. You put your hand
You go
up.
first.
Derek, then Derek, then Suki. Yeah.
I'm
Go on,
happy
Derek.
to. Suki, you go first.
Okay.
Ladies first.
Okay. I don't know if I'm feeling like a lady today. But which is why my camera's not on, because if you saw my hair, it's a little
You sound lovely.
It's really hot today.
And super
I'm not complaining. I'm not complaining because I'm sitting outside right now.
But your brains.
But yes, Mark, I do agree with that point that you made. And one of the things that when I'm working, and I work with a lot of startups, I work with a lot of tech companies, and a lot of them are trying to figure out how they're going to be scaling or organizing. With the startups, using the sort of the SAFE framework, which is scaled agile framework. And that is building in. So what I've been helping to do is build in those factors of who and how they hire from the very beginning. So if I'm working with a startup and it has 2 founders and then they want to bring on a team, it's a matter of looking at the demographics of who they're bringing on, because a lot of times they're just bringing on their friends. And I tell them they have to go beyond that close circle. Yeah, they want people they can trust, but in order for that to be a growth that they don't have to go back and fix 10 years later, because they realize looking at their company, they don't have any people of color, they don't have any women, and they're in their next round of funding and people are saying, well, we don't want to give to you, you're not diverse, you don't have anything there. And they realize that their company is not going to grow because they're building an AI which is built entirely on their model of thinking.
Yes.
So it is a matter, I think, sometimes, especially when it's beginning a company, or even if you're working with a large company and retroactively, it's a matter of building that into not the HR function, because human resources is actually a function of when you're in the company, not a matter of function when you're not in the company. So I think it's something that people need to build into the framework of their particular company.
I love that, Suki, because I think what you're getting at is what Jonathan was saying in the chat, and also it's our 5th bullet point down, where where inherently you're minimizing biases or potential biases collectively, right? Because we all harbor biases, so you're never going to eliminate them, but you're minimizing it, through composition, right? Of your staff. And so it's not even a matter of trying to reconfigure your staff 10 years down the line so it looks good, but that in that interim you're actually bolstering your company so that you can make better decisions, right? You can be able to identify various issues, opportunities, and threats that much sooner, and you're able to understand various types of thinking in the marketplace, right, and elsewhere. So thank you for that, and let's turn this over to Derek.
Yeah. Thanks, Cynthia. I hope you can hear me okay. I've got, as I like to say, everyone at home all the time is still going on here. So if my kids bust in, kind of like August walking his dog, just let them be. I got so many thoughts on all these topics. Number one, I'll say that some of my greatest takeaways these days tend to be ones where I take the time to listen to the great Gen Zers, such as Emily and our team, bring perspectives. The guy who is a Gen Xer, 46 years old, is a leader in our firm, may not always first go to. And I think from our point of view as a leadership team, at least here at Aurora, it's been really important and valuable to bring in now a near mix, perfect mix of male, female, gender points of view, as well as some other points of view that maybe I didn't do earlier in my career. And to the point that Cliff raised about cultural source of competitive advantage, I think that can be heard in today's world also, and you can feel it in different ways. If you are a brand that encourages and accepts total inclusion, whether it be from the client point of view or your partners or your staff, the culture can benefit from that in some incredible ways. I know have seen that lately. I heard a statistic on CNBC this morning that surprised me a little bit, to Harmely's point about socially responsible and environmentally friendly investing. Warren Buffett, one of the greatest value investors of this generation, you see him as a value investor, but may it surprise you as much as it did me to learn that 20% or so of Berkshire Hathaway's portfolio these days is represented by Apple, one of the greatest growth stocks of our time. And some of that surely is stock market movements lately. But when you think through being a value investor, or a growth investor, or a socially responsible investor, that can mean different things to different people. And from that standpoint, you kind of got to get right with what it means to you and the people and the stakeholders that your orbit sort of surrounds. That's my stance on it. But I think in today's world, Madison is in the news where I live today, again, the state senator was attacked overnight. Protests are ongoing downtown, and it's a different world, but one that where I think it just remains incredibly important that we are so inclusive. And I know that the CI Fellows, it's probably one of the things I'm most proud of about the Fellows group today is that we are so, becoming much more balanced, male, female, race, other preferences, that type of stuff. And I just think it's incredible. And I'm proud to be part of this group.
Yeah, we're certainly stronger for it, and I think a heck of a lot more fun
Yep.
as well.
For sure.
Yeah, and I feel that we're really just scratching the surface as we only can, I think, in conversations like this. But I think what I'd like to do now is just to move over to maybe talking about how we're looking at some of the tools that we're using to looking at the spaces that matter to us right now, and so. Just to use this as a segue, and I've just listed, some key types of analysis, but there are other different types of tools that we can talk about too, technology and so forth. But one of the things that strikes me, as I've been working with, with various organizations, and I also teach too, so I'm also looking at this not just from the corporate standpoint and working with various global nonprofits, but also looking at this from the standpoint of educational institutions and what all of this means, is that we're having to not just do the usual scenario work and so forth, but we're really having to dive into issues. We're having to dive into different aspects of steeper pest analysis, looking at the macro environmental factors, right? That are really forcing these types of changes. But also, as things are happening very rapidly in a nearer term, linchpin analysis, things like fishbone analysis and so forth. August, you've got this upcoming workshop on rapid scenarios, through SCIP. And so, I love to talk about what we're using, what we're tapping into that, perhaps, didn't get as much, sort of exercise in the past, because we were maybe conducting, more traditional types of industry or financial or other types of analysis. This is these types of issues require us, to bring in different tools, and so that we can, we can train our sites differently and have, different types of vocabulary also to talk about this. So, so what has changed about, some of the ways that you're approaching the current developments? And I want to open this up to the group and folks, who are the participants in the audience. Please also share your questions as well, about any of these, as well as other types of resources, methods, and tools. So, any thoughts?
Yes, it's Ellen, and I'm having a bad hair day. Anyway,
Sound great though.
Oh, well, good. I'm glad people can at least hear me. I think this is a great time to look at opportunity analysis, not on the list. Because, a lot of us are saying, oh gosh, how are we going to survive? How are we going to make it? And there is definitely an element of that, no kidding. But, you sit and think about some of the companies that are probably doing quite well. Think about the companies that are selling basketball hoops. Man, I see them all over the neighborhood, indoor gyms, just, and for companies to think about and be nimble and think, well, what could I be offering that is in demand today? And so that's the short-term opportunity analysis. And then based on what's happening and we see evolving and looking at the scenarios around COVID, the scenarios around racism, very frankly, bringing in new leadership. There's so many opportunities out there. So I look at opportunity analysis also from the perspective of hiring practices and diversification.
Yeah, that's true. I'm so glad you said this, Ellen, because oftentimes when we're confronted with uncertainty, and especially uncertainty that we might see through maybe more of a defensive lens, or maybe even an outright, fearful and negative lens, we're not looking for the opportunities, right? Psychologically, we're just trying to hunker down. And I think that you're bringing up opportunity analysis is a wonderful counterbalance to that, so that we don't forget, that there's the other piece of that equation, right? Out there in the space. So I really appreciate this. And any other thoughts?
And I'd just like to add to that,
Yeah.
where we're at, a lot of us today, and I hope we're getting out of that, but there's a lot of fear out there today. And it's global fear. It's within our country fear. It's fear of business. It's fear of what's next. It's fear of how am I going to make it through this? It's a lot of fear. And for our people of color, tremendous fear, which we other people are becoming more and more aware of, and need to become even more aware of. So what I would like to see people think about is, along with this opportunity analysis sort of thinking, is fear has its place, but there's always a light at the end of the tunnel, and go find it.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
If I may
excellent.
jump in there quickly.
Yes, Suki, this is yours.
Yes, there is fear, but there's one factor that I think a lot of people seem to miss out on, and that's anger. And as a woman who's Black, I can tell you, I'm still somewhat in the angry phase right now. The rage is gone. The rage was the earlier part, but I'm still very much in the anger part. So I'm equalizing that, but it's still there. Just to keep it real, as you guys know, I'm always keeping it real.
Yeah, and I think these are really important emotions to recognize, right? Because when we're, especially when we're trying to provide intelligent support, we are nowadays surrounded by more emotions than before, in throughout the organizations, in which we serve. And, so, I think, trying to, honor and respect the emotions, and trying to provide, the support that's necessary, and also, trying to ensure that, we are maintaining, the approaches that we need to to maintain, to be able to see the realities as they are, right, and not be driven by sort of our amygdala or our lizard brains. That's particularly challenging. It's always challenging in Intel anyway. I think as Intel pros, we're always having to sort of check ourselves a little bit. But yes, absolutely, yeah. Other thoughts or questions that?
I just wanted to add something.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Wanted to comment on something that Derek said. When he referred to Warren Buffett, it made me think a little bit about his style and his investment style. And he's been at this for close to 70 years. And over the course of that 70 years, he's been very structured in the way he's looked at companies and the way he's looked at their futures. Basically brought things down to what is the most simplistic view of a company, which is, do I understand the business? To say that they have a source of durable competitive advantage, and that's the reason I'll invest in them. You can extend that a little bit. The boomer generation, which still is probably large generations in the leadership roles, they're fading from those roles as they get replaced, but if they're still there, one of the obstacles that the Gen Z have, and some of the Intel folks will have, is that the boomer folks are their clients. And if the clients are boomers and have thought that financial analysis and industry analysis are the ways of the past, and they should be the ways of the future, even convincing them to look at things in a different way is a difficult obstacle to overcome. For instance, when Derek mentioned purchase by...
If I just want to mention, if you could just get a little closer, because you're cutting
okay.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, when he mentioned that Buffett made a big investment in Apple, if you listen to the way Buffett speaks about this understanding what a company does, for the longest part of his career, the reason he didn't invest in Apple was because he didn't understand what they did. And then all of a sudden it came to him, or somebody advised him, that Apple had a way of looking at products and services that was unique. And there was no precedent for it. And it was a kind of a situation where they created a need for something that people didn't realize they needed until they got it. So it wasn't a classic market research kind of study. Is it incrementally better? Is it 5% better or 5% cheaper, et cetera? But the revolutionary products and services is what ultimately convinced Buffett to act on making this investment, because he now realizes that the classic financial and classic industry analysis approaches not necessarily driven by the same drivers that used to drive them.
Mm-hmm.
It may be driven by things that are much more transient, but then become trends that are quicker in terms of adoption. And I know there's data on this. If you look back over the years of major inventions that have occurred over time, and you can go back to when a phone was invented and when a car was invented, and then ultimately you got to the cell phone. And then the curves have been established to take a look at how long adoption took for these major new quote unquote breakthrough technologies. Here's what I found on the web. The period of time that it takes for something to be widely adopted, considered, new and exciting, has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So that what you might consider a future trend, that when something comes about as a result of a major technological change, pace of adoption is going to be much faster, driven largely by the ability to communicate through a variety of sources, social media, 24/7 news, et cetera, which didn't exist when a phone was invented. So people inside corporations should be open to ideas that maybe aren't studied to death, and be able to experiment with things. Maybe, to their surprise, the next major breakthrough. I always think of the
Cliff, can you repeat that again, please? You cut out.
yeah, I think smartphone, the pace at which it was adopted, and the ability to not only use it as a device for as a traditional phone, but turn it into something where you can use it for just about everything, and it's displacing so many other industries. That has become such a regular part of our life, and has become something that Gen Z has always had from when they were born. But for those of us who've been around a long time, they can look at it and say, gee, this thing really changed the world. And I think what the Gen Z folks are interested in is inventing and working on things that change the world. That's their view of the world. Sometimes they'll succeed and sometimes they won't. But they're willing to try, which I think is exciting. And some of the folks that you have to deal with in corporations who are a little bit more conservative and a little bit more backward looking in terms of will say, convince me with data that it's worth it or I'm not going to invest. Mm-hmm. So that's a big obstacle for folks inside in terms of dealing with older management teams.
Cliff, it's interesting you should say that, because I think those of us who are in the world of bias mitigation understand that even while they ask for data, they're not necessarily paying attention to that data, right? Because oftentimes that decision is already made by their system one thinking, and then they're just using their rational brains to rationalize the conclusion they've already drawn. And so, to your earlier point at the beginning, is when you're talking with maybe some of the organizational leadership that aren't coming around, that aren't seeing this, and perhaps are even resistant to seeing this. You're the intel practitioner. Your job is to float this up to them. How do we do this, right, effectively? How do we do this so that we can penetrate that veil and communicate, that understanding that they need to have to make better decisions, right? So I think that's something that folks are struggling with, because these are difficult conversations, and some people have filters and barriers that they're not even aware of, right? As they're as they're processing what's happening. And then when you introduce the idea of, the emotions and the fear, now we're talking, even more biases, that are getting piled on, because when we're more fearful, it was when we're more prone to our own biases, they tend to surface. And so now, we can find that the barriers are even higher, right, to resonate with that intelligence users. So Cliff, you're very experienced in dealing with top management and, those who are also in very well-established, slower-moving industries. Do you have any tips for how people can handle that?
Well, the first thing I would think of is that, and I didn't mention this when I just had some comments before, but one of the other things that the senior management is often dealing with as a matter of the traditional role of a senior manager as a financial manager is, if they're a public company, it's quarterly reports to the stockholders and quarterly reports to the press and to Wall Street. And if you've noticed over the past year, companies who are going through tough times as a result of being shut down, basically, when they have reported on their quarterly earnings, are happy to give you the history, but are not happy to give you a forecast of the future, which is what analysts depend on to be able to assess forward-looking forecasts that they make, which ultimately are used by investors to make decisions as to whether to invest in your stock. So I think one of the ways intelligence people can help is to make sure that they have a tremendously wide network, particularly in a large corporation, to people who are the real inventors in the company, the people who are the real forward-looking thinkers, so that when the CEO comes to you and says, since I can't give them guidance, what can I tell them to keep the stock price up? And if it's even something where you're saying, well, we're doing some research in an area which is going to change the way that electricity is generated, or we're looking at research in a way where we're going to have flying cars, or whatever it is that's going to become the main changing thing that you're inventing in a company. Maybe it's still in the stage of development. Without over-promising, that's where I think an intelligence person, the insight to the CEO and his team, by knowing his internal network, to the point where sometimes even skunk works kinds of projects are the ones that turn into the big successes. I'm often reminded of the book that was written, I think it was Tom Peters wrote the book, about how decisions were made at General Electric. And he asked Jack Welch, he said, what was your strategy for getting smart ideas? And he said, well, I would just invite people who had an idea to make an appointment and show up at my office. And if I thought it was a great idea, then I would just give them the money to go ahead. And the fellow who wrote the book said, well, gee, give me an example of a couple things that came out of that, because I don't believe that. He says, well, engine. Another one was the light bulb. Another one was the washing machine. I sometimes, how many things can happen inside a corporation which are either tangential or close to your core competency, where your company can move if you give people who have entrepreneurial, or I guess the term is entrepreneurial spirit inside a large company, take some risk on something that's new and have someone at the top listen and fund it.
Cliff, that's so funny, because I worked at General Electric, or GE Capital, and in fact, Jack was very reactive in that way. And I was going to mention something about that, because it sort of ties into what you're saying. So one of the things Welsh always looked for was the root cause. We had to go through root cause analyses on every process, every procedure once a year, and cut out cost and work. Sometimes it also meant people were cut out. They used to call him Neutron Jack, because the buildings would still be there and the people would all be gone. So he had a vested interest in that, but it almost always works. So I would say, to some degree, with some of the things that we're undergoing right now from cultural change, it's very important to get to the root cause, not just what we're seeing as the cause today, We've been working on diversity and working on racism for decades, and we still haven't gotten to that point. And so let's not put a Band-Aid on it again. Let's really dig down and figure out what needs to change. Flipping that over, in terms of CI, it seems to me that with the rate of change changing and all of these other changes that we're dealing with, global issues, especially things like pandemics, et cetera, perhaps what companies need to do is incorporate into their strategy process, as well as anything having to do with CI, these other kinds of factors, these cultural factors. I think sometimes we don't take into account how much the culture is changing until there's like a big blip. And I think from this point forward, a lot of people, futurists included, are saying it's not going to be a big blip anymore. It's going to be blip after blip after blip. So put that into the thinking process and make sure you address that. That way the corporate leaders can't forget about it because it's right there. Okay, we got to look at that and incorporate that into the CI process.
Thanks very much for that, Claudia. And I do want to mention, you mentioned root cause analysis, and fishbone analysis is actually another name for that on this slide. So I just want to point that out for folks who are not familiar with it, and it is something that is can be a very, very powerful tool along with the rest of these for I think the times we're in. I also want to mention that Jonathan Dunnett had also shared a website, 12manage.com, for those of you who do not have access to the chat. And he says it's a very old looking site, but in terms of bringing in different models for various types of analysis, this has always brought forward some interesting tools. So thank you. And Richard Caldwell, as we begin to wind down, asks, is there anyone using decision support tools for remote working, brainstorming, polling, ranking, collaboration? So before we wrap it up, let me just open that question up to see if there are any thoughts about that. I can tell you, Richard, or maybe if people are just kind of queuing up, that I've been using mind maps a lot. To sort a lot of this out, because it's really a combination of brainstorming, but it's also it's also using network thinking. And so I find that to be very, very powerful to help with decision support, as well as in an overlaying traditional decision trees over that. So I'll just kick that off by saying that's what that's what I've been doing. Anyone else have any thoughts?
I wanted to remind people that there were a series of companies that did very good traditional market analysis and totally blew it. Those were the disk drive companies that were studied by Christensen. And then the other thing that I read, I'm going to put this together, is that the companies that did included social issues and environmental issues in their planning did better financially, but it's not clear that they did better because they included those issues, but because they had a more robust process because they were more broadly based. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you use a very traditional approach, you may be locked in. But if you try to broaden it to include more issues and more aspects of life and the marketplace, et cetera, then the approach may be good. So garbage in, garbage, I'm not saying garbage in, garbage out, but I'm just saying this is maybe a time where we really need to think outside the box, which is what, Apple did for a long time.
Yeah.
And
as a process person, I can as a process person, I can appreciate that. And so I see that we're at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to wrap things up here. But I want to leave us with a parting thought, and I think Mark Chessel, has done that for us very nicely. Because as I mentioned, we're really just, this is the tip of the iceberg. And there's lots more to be said about this, and we're building a community of practice now, where we can take these conversations and continue them. And so we'll be making that announcement soon. But in the meantime, Mark asks, so what is the problem we want to solve? Act fast opportunities, avoiding unpleasant surprises because we have blind spots, ethical and socially responsible management, ingratiating ourselves with a demographic, wanting to be good people who are part of the solution. What I hear is that we are a group of thoughtful people reeling from change, I sure am, and who, excuse me, and who have a human desire to do something, in caps. And then he continues by saying, what helps me is that today's turmoil has real potential for us finally to jettison the awful practices of the past and to come out better. That is my optimistic thought for today. So I do appreciate that. And I also appreciate the frank discussions we're having, and thank you, Suki, for also bringing us there. As we wind down further, as we get to the very end here, my cursor. So I just want to mention a few things that are coming up. The CI Fellows, we are in our nominations period for 2020 Fellows. So that ends Tuesday, July 7th. So that deadline has been extended. There's a bit more time to do that. So if you think of somebody, who is someone that you would like to put up for fellowship, go to our website, cifellows.com, and towards the bottom of the webpage, you'll see a link for the call for nominations, and then you'll find instructions there. Also, our mentorship program is up and running, and the link right there is will take you to more details, or you can just go to cifellows.com, go under Council Initiatives in the top navigation bar under Mentorship, and you'll find what you need there, or you can email cimentoring@cifellows.com. And I hope you'll join us for our next webinar, AI and the Future of CI. And CI fellow Shelley Frine will be part of a panel about this. And this will be July 29th. So it's always the last Wednesday of each month. And then just looking even further ahead, we'll have our first virtual summit series coming up September 15th to 16th. And so it'll be a couple of days doing a deep dive on a topic, and we'll have more detail to share with you on that. So thank you so much, and I hope that you'll remain connected. Our newsletter is there, so you can email that to join to get updates on our various announcements, including webinars, and you can also find recordings available soon on our website. And join us on social media also, to share your thoughts and to access various types of announcements. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for a very thoughtful discussion. Now, I'm always left a bit frustrated by this, as much as I'm gratified, because I want to stay longer, and I want us to have deeper conversation.
I guess that would be the grand irony.
Technology's wonderful when it works.
She wants to stay longer, but Cynthia, you cut yourself off.
Oh, that's a hell of a note.
On that note, I'll say goodbye to everybody, and
Yeah, me too.
talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Yep.
All right, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
I think we're all
Good night.
leaving, Cynthia.
I'm sorry, I missed that, Suki. What was that?
You're back. We could.
Everybody left because you cut it off.
Well, actually, I was just about to to stop the recording when this whole thing cut out. So I don't, you stop me. So
Thank you for my evening laugh. I appreciate that.
well, it was actually good fortuitous timing that it happened when it did, because that was when the recording would have stopped. But I'm glad to be back. And Suki, hey, thanks a lot for still just keeping us honest and keeping us grounded.
Yeah, I could have really gone in, but I thought.
Well, hey, you know what?
I have a post that I've written, and I've edited and edited and edited, because I know that there are people in my network, there are people in the networks attached to me. I don't think they could handle that. You say if you use the word rage, people automatically are afraid. But it's because they're not willing to see the full picture.